Hello! Recently, Lighthouse Baptist Church, along with several other Baptist churches across the country, went on an inspirational tour of the nations of Jordan and Israel. I'd like to take you on a journey through these countries and the experiences we lived as we traveled from site to site. There was a great excitement for the trip, and we had a long plane flight ahead of us. There was a moment, though, that we thought we weren't all going to fit on the bus, but we made it, barely. We arrived at LAX International Airport, and so it began. The long 14-hour flight to Jordan, and we first came into the city of Amman. Coming into the city so late, and having about 6 hours of sleep or so, we were ready for the breakfast buffet, which I might add was absolutely delicious. There were a few hours of driving to do to our first stop, and so we really got a chance to soak in what the Jordanian country looks like. The first site we came to was Mount Nebo, and this is where in Deuteronomy 34, God showed Moses the promised land before Moses was to die. There was an ancient Byzantine-style church on top of the mountain where we got a chance to see mosaics that were over 1,000 years old. The view from the cliff was a bit clouded this morning, but this would be the point where Moses would have overlooked portions of the land that God would give the children of Israel. And just over those mountains is the Israeli border. It was time to trek through the desert to Wadi Rum, where we would stay in these glamorous tents overnight. They call it glamping. The desert this time of year was rather cool, and we didn't have to endure the extreme heat. It was awesome, though, that we did get to cruise in these trucks through the desert and take it easy. It's almost hard to believe that thousands of years later, this desert is still being tracked by camel caravans. When we got to Wadi Rum, it was night, and I'll tell you what, for being in the middle of the desert, these tents that we lived in for the night weren't that bad. After an amazing church service in the morning, we were off to the reason why we were here in Jordan, the city of Petra and its great treasury. When they talked about a narrow pass going into Petra, they were not kidding. We would have to walk over 1.5 miles to get to the main entrance into the city, and the scenery was definitely interesting. We did have to stop for a photo opportunity, and it almost looks like we're being squished in between two mountains. As we trekked on, we did notice the carvings in the sides of the wall where ancient pipes used to be, and they would bring fresh water into the city from miles away. As we drew nearer to the entrance of the city, one of the 7 wonders of the world started to come into view, Petra's great structure called the Treasury. This magnificent structure was one of 2 that are in the city that are the most preserved in the city, and this one by far has the least damage and had more protection from the earthquakes and the random flash floods that would occur. We continued further into the city and saw many great ancient structures. Petra was in the former land of Edom in the Bible, who were the descendants of Esau. The land of Edom was judged by God in the book of Obadiah, and they were conquered by a people called the Nabateans, who also built upon this city. This city prospered due to being in the middle of the trade routes connecting Asia and Egypt and Europe. Of course, in the middle of the city, you could find an ancient coffee shop with Wi-Fi. Well, okay, maybe it's not that ancient, actually. A few of us decided to brave the climb up to see what they call the monastery, which was the second most preserved ruin in Petra. There would be around 1,000 steps and uphill climbs before we would reach the peak, but after a while, we did finally make it, and what a wonder it truly was. We had to get down the mountain before dark because it was rather dangerous, so we had to hurry. On the way, we met a new friend. Meet Goat. Anyways, before our last stretch back, we got one final glimpse of the treasury. Our last day in Jordan, we visited the city of Jerash. This was an ancient city that was called one of the Decapolis, or 10 cities in Greek. Some of these were referenced in the Gospels, Matthew and Mark. We met in front of what they called Hadrian's Gate, named for the Roman Emperor Hadrian. Only the emperor or really important officials were allowed to go through the center gate, while all others had to pass to the sides. Many of our group thought, well, since Christ has made us kings and priests, we're walking through the center. Amen. Revelation 1:6, by the way. Once through the gate, we came into the great hippodrome, which was used for horse and chariot racing, though it has long since fallen apart. The theater next to it, though, was well preserved, and the acoustics within were amazing. We even had some guests come to join us, and they brought bagpipes. On to the rest of the city. Jerash was truly amazing to see, and though earthquakes had shaken up the place, pun intended, there were parts left standing. The former Temple of Zeus, the Cardo, or heart of the city, a massive water fountain, and just off the Cardo Road and up 2 flights of steps lies the Temple of Artemis. While Paul was in a different city at the time of this story, the Temple of Artemis, or the Roman name Diana, is mentioned in Acts 19. After intense border security, we drove into Israel, and God was not kidding when he said that the land would be flowing with milk and honey. Our guide, who was a retired 30-year veteran of the Israeli Defense Force, was absolutely amazing, and he was very detailed with his historical knowledge on the different sites. After settling in the city of Tiberias, we went around the Sea of Galilee to see many different sites. One was Gadara, where the demoniac once dwelled, and the city of Chorazin was the next, where in Matthew 11:21, Jesus pronounced woe upon the city for their unbelief. Now just off the city, we saw what seemed a colony of conies, the same that are talked about in Psalm 104, where it says, "The high hills are a refuge for the wild goats, and the rocks for the conies." Although, there seemed that there was one that was not very happy with us coming upon his condominium. We went to Mount Beatitudes, where Jesus would have preached the Sermon on the Mount. The mount overlooking the Galilee was truly beautiful. And later that day, we got to try out our sea legs to take a boat ride. And really, with as windy as it was, it's not hard to believe that a storm could kick up like in Jesus and the disciples' day and what they had to endure. After some Bible preaching on the Galilee, it was time to move on into the forest. We came unto Mount Hermon, where in Matthew 16:18, Jesus would question Peter about who he was and said that he, being Jesus, would build the church and the gates of hell would not prevail against it. What is interesting is that Jesus was at the foot of the mountain, where there was actually a place called the gates of hell. Here, the pagans worshipped the god Pan. Jesus' play on words characterized his victory over hell and the victory of the church. We traveled to see several sites through the day, and we saw the city of Capernaum and the synagogue that Jesus would have preached from, the spring of Gideon, the ruins of Bet Shean, where King Saul's body was taken after his death in the Old Testament, and then to the river Jordan, This is where we met an Ethiopian Christian group who sang several songs by the river's edge. The next morning and final leg of our trip, we finally came into Jerusalem. The morning rain ended and we beheld a truly amazing sight that we just could not have planned for. And what another opportunity for a group photo as well. The first stop was in the Garden of Gethsemane, and this was a truly sobering place, as this was the garden where our Savior, as in Luke 22:44 said, and being in agony he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was as it were great drops of blood falling down to the ground. On the way out, we passed a biblical restaurant. Yes, biblical. We had some time to shop in the marketplace in the Christian Quarter, and this marketplace was definitely different than what we were used to in the United States. We even had one merchant come up and say, "Hello, my friend. Come and see what I have and give me a chance to rip you off." Once we spent way too much money in the marketplace, it was time to go through the Lion's Gate and into the great stone church that is said to have the best acoustics in the world. We ran into our Ethiopian friends from back of the Jordan River as well, and they made the place ring. It was our turn, and Lighthouse Baptist Church demonstrated that we could definitely hold our own, making the church ring as well. The next day was Sunday, and we went to the Hebrew University to have a great service with testimonies and a message preached by Pastor Kirkland. Later, we drove out beside the Dead Sea and went to Engedi Spring. While some got distracted with other things, others ventured halfway up the mountain to the double spring arcing over the cliff. Some even ventured to the top of the mountain and gave a view of the valley below and the Dead Sea. This day was a day of back-to-back mountains, and we went to go see the mountaintop fortress of Masada. There were two ways to get up the mountain, one by cable car or hiking, so a few of us decided to take the path less chosen and trek up the mountain. Once we reached the top, we had a chance to look around the fortress, which, to my surprise, was quite larger than I expected. On the backside of the mountain, we saw the Roman army encampments when they besieged the Jewish rebels. Then they made a massive dirt ramp to get up to the wall of the fortress. It's a bit worn down due to almost 2,000 years of erosion, but it's still a pretty impressive sight to look upon. The next day we went to the Temple Mount, where the Muslims built the Dome of the Rock upon where the Jewish temple once stood. We even got to see the Wailing Wall, which had different ceremonial things going on at the time due to Hanukkah. We even had another great opportunity for a group photo. We then went to the Garden Tomb, where it is believed with much evidence that this very well may have been the tomb of Jesus Christ. We continued our way to see Golgotha, or the place of the skull where Jesus was crucified. On our way back, we were stopped by the Israeli Secret Service so that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu could pass by. Our last stop was back at the Temple Mount, where we could explore the ruins around the former temple. We finished by the southern gate of the temple for some preaching. There were many places that you wondered if Jesus Christ once walked them. But these southern steps were once walked, without a doubt, by the Messiah. He would have come through this gate that was mysteriously blocked when the Turks occupied this area for centuries. On the final day of exploration, it was pretty much a free day, and some of us chose to go and explore some of Jerusalem's museums. Both the Bible Lands Museum and the Israel National Museum had fascinating items that made the trip well worth the time going. From ancient jewelry of various cultures, to ceremonial items, to ancient cuneiform tablets and mosaics, we spent almost 7 hours exploring both museums. There were 3 items that stood out due to the powerful message that they taught. The first was the bone box of Caiaphas, the high priest. This was the man who sought to have Jesus crucified. Boy, was he disappointed when that grave turned up empty. The second was the only stone to have Pontius Pilate's name on it, verifying he was the Roman prelate during the time of Christ. And finally, the Israeli flag flown during its independence in 1948. To cap off the night and the trip itself was the colorful sight of the suspension bridge by our hotel. Such powerful memories were made on this trip that not one that went on it would forget. I pray that this has been not only a blessing to you, but also an encouragement to go to Israel yourself and walk the steps that our Messiah once walked.